My name is Alyssa, 33 years old, and for my entire adult life, my family treated me like a financial burden. Last Friday, at a Michelin star restaurant, my brother threw a $20 bill at my chest and laughed loudly, telling me I could not even afford a cup of coffee. He had no idea that the corporate credit card he just used to pay for dinner was funded entirely by my private equity firm. When Monday morning rolled around, I made one phone call and legally froze $4.7 million of his company capital. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogant people always orchestrate their own downfall. The waiter poured another measure of the $800 red wine into my brother Bradley and his polished crystal glass. We were sitting in a private dining room at a luxury restaurant in New York City, celebrating my mother Patricia and her 62nd birthday. The chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white tablecloths, but the atmosphere at our table was anything but warm. Bradley, who was 36 and the self-proclaimed visionary chief executive officer of a tech startup called NovaStream, swirled the dark red wine and took a loud, appreciative sip. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that screamed new money. Next to him sat his wife Jasmine. Jasmine was a stunning African-American woman with flawless makeup and intricate micro-braids pulled into an elegant high bun. She carried a $15,000 designer bag that she made sure to place prominently on an empty chair. Jasmine leaned across the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her crystal water glass. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. "Alyssa." She purred, her voice laced with that specific brand of fake concern reserved for the less fortunate. "I really admire your bravery. I could never go out to a Michelin star restaurant wearing a plain, unbranded blazer like that. Are you not worried people will think you wandered in from a temporary staffing agency?" Bradley chuckled loudly, slicing into his dry-aged steak. "Give her a break, Jasmine. She is just a junior risk analyst. She probably bought that at a thrift store to save up for her rent this month." My father, Richard, laughed heartily from the head of the table, adjusting his silk tie. "Well," he boomed, "it is a good thing your brother is here to treat us to a real meal. Bradley just closed a $5 million Series A funding round for his company today. That is what real ambition looks like, Alyssa. You should take notes instead of settling for mediocrity." I did not react. I simply smiled politely and took a bite of my roasted sea bass. They thought I was a quiet, struggling employee, living paycheck to paycheck. They thought I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic because I was poor. They did not know that the unbranded blazer I wore was a bespoke piece from an exclusive private tailor in Milan. And they certainly did not know that the $5 million funding round Bradley was bragging about came directly from Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings was the private equity firm I founded, built from the ground up, and currently served as the majority shareholder. I was literally the person funding his luxurious lifestyle. My quiet demeanor was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated strategy to protect my wealth from their greedy hands. The evening dragged on with Bradley and Jasmine dominating the conversation. They bragged endlessly about their newly leased luxury electric car, their upcoming vacation to the Maldives, and how exhausting it was to be part of the city elite. My mother Patricia beamed at them with absolute adoration, occasionally shooting me a look of profound disappointment. When the waiter finally brought the leather folder containing the check, Bradley snatched it up with a theatrical flourish. He did not even look at the total before dropping his heavy metal corporate card onto the silver tray. "Put it on NovaStream," he announced proudly. "The perks of being the boss means the company pays for everything." As the waiter turned to leave, I raised my hand slightly. "Excuse me," I said in a quiet voice. "Could I get a black coffee to go?" The waiter nodded courteously and added the $8 coffee to the tab. Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the acoustic panels of the private room. He reached into his designer wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and threw it directly at my chest. The paper fluttered down and landed softly in my lap. "You cannot even afford coffee," he sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. Take it, little sister. Consider it charity. I genuinely do not know how you survive in this city on a peasant salary. Jasmine giggled, hiding her smile behind her wine glass. You are too generous, Bradley, she cooed, touching his arm gently. She really needs it more than we do. My father nodded in agreement, while my mother just sighed, looking at the $20 bill in my lap, as if it were a physical manifestation of my life failures. I looked down at the money, then back up at my brother and his smug, triumphant face. The room felt incredibly still. I could feel the weight of their collective contempt pressing down on me. But I also felt the absolute power of knowing the truth. I calmly picked up the $20 bill, folding it neatly. I placed it inside my pocket, knowing their entire world would shatter into a million pieces by Monday morning. I stood up smoothly, pushing my chair back from the table. Thank you for the meal, I said without any anger. I turned and left. Before my hand could touch the brass handle of the heavy oak door, my father, Richard, slammed his hand on the table. The crystal glasses rattled and the entire table erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, unified sound that I had grown used to over the years. Alyssa, do not walk away when your brother is trying to teach you a lesson, my father commanded. He pointed a finger at me, his face flushed from the expensive wine. You are 33 years old. You are still renting a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood and driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic. You need to learn how to hustle like your brother. Bradley smirked, swirling his wine. Exactly, Dad. I am just trying to help her understand the real world. My father nodded vigorously. Bradley just secured a $5 million Series A funding round for NovaStream today. Investors threw money at him because they see his genius. They see a winner. You should be taking notes instead of acting like a fragile victim. If you had half of his ambition, you would not have to beg for a cup of coffee. The table fell silent, waiting for my reaction. They expected tears. They expected me to lower my head and apologize for ruining the mood. I did not cry. I did not argue. I stood completely still. The waiter appeared from the hallway and gently handed me my to-go cup of black coffee. I took it with a polite nod. I reached into my pocket and felt the crisp $20 bill Bradley had thrown at me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot coffee. Good question, Bradley, I said, my voice chillingly calm. Let us see who knows how to survive by next week. I did not wait for his response. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and walked out into the main dining room. I headed straight for the host stand at the front of the restaurant. I need to pay for my portion of the meal in the private dining room, I told the maitre d', the sea bass and the black coffee. Please put it on this card. I handed him my personal, sleek black titanium card. I was not going to let a single cent of my meal be charged to the NovaStream corporate account. As the transaction processed, I glanced at the itemized receipt. Bradley had charged over $2,000 to his company that night. It was a clear violation of the operating agreement he signed with my private equity firm. I walked out into the cool night air and located my Honda Civic. My father loved to mock this car. He thought it was a symbol of my financial failure. In reality, it was the perfect camouflage. In private equity, anonymity is your greatest asset. I started the engine and drove away. I did not drive to a cramped apartment. Instead, I drove to the financial district and pulled into the secure underground garage of a luxury high-rise. The valet took my keys. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor and stepped into my sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. This was the life I had built in total silence. I walked straight to my home office and picked up my phone. I dialed David. He was a brilliant corporate attorney and the public-facing chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. Because I preferred to remain the silent majority shareholder, David handled all the face-to-face meetings. Bradley had negotiated the $5 million deal with David, completely unaware that David reported directly to me. David answered on the second ring. Good evening, Alyssa. How was the birthday dinner? Enlightening, I replied, setting my coffee cup on the mahogany desk. Bradley just put a $2,000 dinner on the Nova Stream corporate card. He is also leasing a Tesla Model S using company funds, and his wife is carrying a $15,000 designer bag that I strongly suspect was purchased the same way. I heard David sigh through the phone speaker. We just wired them the first tranche of the $5 million Series A funding this morning. The covenants of the investment contract strictly prohibit the use of capital for non-business luxury expenses. Exactly, I said, pulling up the NovaStream financial dashboard on my monitor. Apex Holdings has real-time access to their ledgers as a condition of the funding. I want you to initiate a full audit of their expenses over the weekend. Flag every single unauthorized transaction. I want the exact dollar amount of what he has embezzled. Consider it done. David said, his tone turning razor sharp. And once we have the report, we activate the emergency divestment clause I instructed. Bradley breached the fiduciary duty covenant within 12 hours of receiving the funds. That gives us the legal right to freeze their corporate accounts and claw back our entire investment immediately. Have the legal notices drafted by Sunday night. David chuckled softly. He is going to panic. The margin calls will destroy him. He wanted to teach me how the real world works, I said, staring at the city lights reflecting off my office window. So we are going to give him a masterclass. I want you to call his office first thing Monday morning. Do not send an email. Call him directly. Tell him Apex Holdings is pulling all $4.7 million of the remaining capital. Understood, David replied. Have a good weekend, Alyssa. I ended the call and leaned back. The $20 bill was still in my pocket. I smoothed the creases. Bradley thought his fragile startup made him a titan of industry. He had spent his life being coddled and praised by our parents, shielded from every consequence. They had funded his early failures and constantly told him he was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, they had looked at my quiet progress and called it a failure. I spent the weekend reviewing the financial data. Bradley had not just bought dinner and a car. He had expensed luxury hotel stays, first-class flights, and extravagant gifts. He was burning through our investment money at a terrifying rate. Sunday night, I approved the final legal notices drafted by David. The trap was fully set. Bradley had built his entire identity on the illusion of success, an illusion funded entirely by my money. I went to sleep that night feeling perfectly calm. The weekend was over. Monday morning was rapidly approaching, and the countdown to absolute destruction had officially begun. Monday morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the NovaStream executive suite. Bradley sat behind a massive custom-cut marble desk that cost more than my entire college education. He leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, his feet resting casually on the polished surface. He was holding a freshly brewed cappuccino in a branded ceramic mug. Across from him sat Jasmine. She was posing on a velvet imported sofa, taking selfies with her phone to showcase the panoramic view of the financial district behind her. "Babe, you have to admit I completely outsmarted them," Bradley said, taking a loud sip of his coffee. "These private equity guys think they hold all the cards just because they write the checks, but they are clueless. That guy David from Apex Holdings handed over $5 million and barely asked any questions about our operational overhead. It is basically free money." Jasmine smiled, adjusting the strap of her new $15,000 designer bag so it would be visible in her next photo. "You deserve it, Bradley. You are a visionary." Everyone at the restaurant on Friday could see it. By the way, the valet brought the new Tesla Model S around to the VIP parking spot this morning. "Did you make sure the lease is entirely under the corporate account? I do not want that payment anywhere near our personal credit." Bradley laughed, a deep, arrogant sound that echoed in the cavernous office. "Of course I did. I categorized it as a necessary corporate vehicle for executive transit. Same with the dinner on Friday, the country club membership, and the upcoming trip to the Maldives. It is all filed under client acquisition and team building. These investors are too busy playing golf to look at the micro details of a tech startup expense report." We have at least 18 months before they even ask for a quarterly review. By then, we will just raise a Series B round and pay off whatever we spent. It is the easiest game in the world once you know how to play it. Jasmine blew a kiss toward him. You are brilliant. Speaking of your family, your sister looked absolutely pathetic on Friday, asking for a to-go cup for black coffee. I honestly felt embarrassed to be seen at the same table as her. You really put her in her place with that $20 bill. She needs to understand the social hierarchy. Bradley smirked, adjusting his expensive cuffs. Alyssa is a lost cause. She has no vision. She works a miserable 9-to-5 job and thinks saving coupons is a financial strategy. She will be renting that tiny apartment until she is 60. It is honestly exhausting having to carry the entire reputation of the family on my shoulders, but someone has to do it. Right as the words left his mouth, the sleek multi-line phone on his desk beeped. His assistant spoke through the intercom. Mr. Bradley, there is a call for you on line 1. It is David from Apex Holdings. He says it is extremely urgent. Bradley grinned at Jasmine and pointed to the phone. See, they probably want to invite me to some exclusive investor gala. Watch how I handle these corporate suits. He pressed the speakerphone button so Jasmine could hear. David, great to hear from you on a Monday morning. I was just looking over our expansion roadmap. We are ready to scale NovaStream to the moon. To what do I owe the pleasure? There was no friendly greeting in response. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and absolute. When David finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the precise mechanical tone of a corporate executioner. Bradley, I am not calling to discuss your expansion roadmap, David said. I am calling to inform you that as of 8 o'clock this morning, Apex Holdings has officially activated the emergency divestment clause outlined in Section 4 of your investment agreement. We have contacted our banking partners and instructed them to freeze all NovaStream corporate accounts immediately. Bradley lowered his feet from the desk. His smile faltered. Wait, what are you talking about? Freeze the accounts. You just wired the funds on Friday. There must be some kind of clerical error. There is no error, David replied smoothly. The investment covenants you signed explicitly restrict the use of Series A capital to approved operational expenses software development and verified payroll. Apex Holdings requires real-time ledger access, which you authorized. Over the weekend, our risk analysis team conducted an emergency audit of your expenditures. Jasmine stopped taking selfies. She slowly lowered her phone, her eyes darting toward the speaker. Bradley sat up straight, his grip tightening on his coffee mug. David, listen. Bradley stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its usual arrogant boom. Startups have dynamic expense needs. I had to entertain some high-level prospects this weekend. If there is a flagged transaction, we can just reclassify it. We can talk about this in person. We are past the point of talking, David said. The audit confirmed severe financial irregularities and blatant embezzlement. Specifically, you charged an $800 bottle of wine and a $2,000 dinner to the company on Friday night. You executed a corporate lease for a Tesla Model S for personal use. You also authorized a $15,000 wire transfer that precisely matches the retail price of a luxury handbag your wife recently acquired. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. Because these expenditures constitute a material breach of fiduciary duty and an act of corporate fraud. David continued without pausing for a breath. Apex Holdings is withdrawing the remaining $4.7 million of our capital investment. The freeze is already in effect. Your company credit cards will decline. Your payroll transfers will bounce. Legal notices have been dispatched to this office via courier, and we have filed a formal complaint regarding your complete misuse of investor funds. Jasmine stood up from the velvet sofa, her hands trembling. Bradley, she whispered frantically. Bradley, what is he saying? Do something. Tell him it is a mistake. Bradley stared at the speakerphone with wide, unblinking eyes. He tried to form a sentence, but his throat was completely dry. David, please. If you pull, the 4.7 million Nova Stream goes under today. We have vendor invoices pending. We have office leases. I will face a massive margin call. You cannot just destroy my company over one weekend of expenses. I will pay it back. I will write a personal check for the dinner and the car. Just unlock the accounts. You do not have the personal liquidity to pay it back, Bradley David said. And even if you did, Apex Holdings does not do business with liabilities. You thought you could treat our investment like a personal piggy bank. You thought our risk analysis team was not paying attention. You were entirely wrong. Bradley, say something, Jasmine pleaded, her voice pitching into a high panic. We are done here, David concluded. Direct all future communications to our legal department. Have a nice Monday. The line went dead with a sharp click. The dial tone echoed loudly in the extravagant, quiet office. Bradley sat perfectly still, staring at the flashing red light on his desk phone. The reality of what had just happened crashed into him with the physical force of a speeding train. In less than 3 minutes, his entire empire had been totally dismantled. The millions of dollars he had bragged about were gone. The company he used to inflate his fragile ego was now functionally bankrupt. His hand began to shake uncontrollably. The branded ceramic mug he was holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the edge of the marble desk and plummeted to the floor. The mug shattered into dozens of sharp pieces, sending hot black coffee splashing across the expensive hardwood floor. Bradley did not even look down. He just stared blankly at the empty wall, the crushing concept of sheer survival echoing relentlessly in his empty, panicked mind. Bradley stood paralyzed as the spilled coffee seeped into the imported Persian rug. The silence in his office was violently broken by a barrage of notifications pinging on his computer screen. Within 2 hours of David ending the call, the corporate accounts were officially locked. The domino effect was immediate and absolutely ruthless. By Wednesday afternoon, NovaStream was an absolute freefall. Automated payroll transfers bounced, triggering furious emails from his lead developers and marketing team. Vendors who supplied their crucial server space suspended operations due to invalid payment methods, causing the company website to crash. Legal threats flooded his inbox faster than he could read them. The worst blow came from his personal broker on Thursday morning. The margin call hit him with devastating force. Bradley had arrogantly leveraged his own equity to secure additional personal loans, betting on the Series A capital to cover his tracks and inflate his lifestyle. Now the bank demanded immediate repayment to cover the massive deficit. If he could not produce the cash, they would liquidate his remaining assets. He was looking at total, inescapable bankruptcy and the very real threat of criminal investigation. Desperation stripped away his arrogance, leaving behind the panicked little boy who always ran to his parents when he broke a window. He locked his office door, ignored the frantic knocking of his assistant, and dialed his father. "Dad, you have to help me," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking perfectly to garner maximum sympathy. "I am under a massive attack. A predatory private equity firm is trying to steal NovaStream right out from under me. They used a dirty legal loophole to freeze my accounts and stall my operations. They want to bankrupt me so they can buy my proprietary technology for pennies on the dollar. I am fighting them with everything I have, but I need a bridge loan to cover my payroll and keep the lights on until my lawyers can sort this out." Richard and Patricia, who worshipped the ground Bradley walked on, swallowed the lie completely. They assured him they would fix it. They always did. They believed their son was a misunderstood genius, targeted by jealous corporate sharks. My phone buzzed Thursday evening while I was reviewing the final asset seizure documents in my penthouse. It was a text from my mother, written with her usual demanding tone. "Get to the house immediately. Family emergency. Do not make excuses." I smiled, locked my screen, and grabbed my car keys. I had been waiting for this exact message. I drove my 10-year-old Honda to the affluent suburb where my parents lived, parking it in the driveway right next to Bradley and his leased Tesla Model S. The irony was not lost on me. That luxury car technically belonged to my firm now, and the man inside the house was begging for a lifeline from the very sister he had humiliated just days prior. I walked through the front door and was immediately directed to the formal living room. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with anxiety and misplaced anger. Bradley sat slumped on the expensive leather sofa, his head buried in his hands. He was playing the role of the exhausted, embattled corporate genius perfectly. My mother hovered over him anxiously, rubbing his shoulders and whispering words of comfort. My father paced the hardwood floor, his face red with righteous anger. Jasmine stood near the fireplace with her arms crossed, tightly glaring at me as if my mere presence was a personal insult. "Sit down, Alyssa," my father ordered, not even offering a basic greeting or asking how my day was. "Your brother is in a massive crisis. Some vulture capitalists are trying to ruin his company with illegal account freezes. We have pooled all our liquid savings to help him fight this. But we are short. We need you to step up and do your part for this family." My mother stopped rubbing Bradley and his shoulders and pointed an accusatory finger at me. "You are going to liquidate your retirement accounts, all of your 401k money, and you need to go to your bank tomorrow morning and take out a personal loan for whatever maximum amount they will approve. We need at least $80,000 from you by Monday morning to keep NovaStream afloat." I stared at them, letting the sheer audacity of their demand hang in the quiet room. I kept my posture relaxed and my face entirely blank. "You want me to empty my life savings, pay the early withdrawal penalties, and go into massive personal debt for a company I have absolutely nothing to do with?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat. Before my parents could respond, Jasmine scoffed loudly, taking a step forward. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the floor. "Do not act so incredibly selfish, Alyssa. You do not have kids or a real life. You rent a cheap apartment and have zero actual responsibilities. Bradley supports this entire family. He is a provider. He is a chief executive officer building a legacy. You are just a single woman pushing papers at a boring desk job. Make yourself useful for once in your miserable life and sacrifice for the greater good of this family." She looked me up and down with the exact same disgust she had displayed at the Michelin star restaurant. "It is time you actually contributed something instead of just taking up space. Give him the money." I looked from Jasmine to my mother, who was nodding in agreement, and then to my father, who stood waiting for my compliance. Finally, my eyes landed on Bradley, who peered at me through his fingers, expecting me to cave to the immense family pressure, like I always did when we were younger. They honestly believed that their constant bullying and emotional manipulation would force me into submission. The trap was set perfectly, but they were the ones standing inside it. I remained seated on the edge of the armchair. I looked directly at my mother, then at my father, and finally settled my gaze on Jasmine, who was still glaring at me. "No," I said. The single syllable hung in the air, sharp and absolute. There were no apologies or lengthy explanations. It was just a flat, uncompromising rejection of their completely absurd demand. My mother blinked rapidly, stunned by my defiance. "No. What do you mean, no?" she asked, her voice rising in a high, panicked pitch. "You are not listening, Alyssa. Your brother desperately needs this money to save his company." "I heard you perfectly," I replied, keeping my tone completely level. "You want me to bankrupt my future, drain my retirement accounts, and take on massive personal debt to pay for Bradley and his catastrophic financial mistakes. And my answer is no. I will absolutely not give him a single dime today or ever." My father stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck visibly bulged as he glared down at me. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice vibrating with unfiltered rage. "Your brother is facing absolute financial ruin because of greedy corporate monsters, and you sit there acting like a selfish, spoiled brat. You have always been terribly jealous of him. Always. You resent him because he actually has vision. You hate him because he took massive risks to build an empire while you settled for a pathetic, invisible life." Bradley let out a calculated, miserable sigh. "Dad, just leave her alone. Bradley muttered, burying his face in his hands. I should have known she would not help me. She has always hated seeing me succeed. Jasmine scoffed, loudly shaking her head. It is truly pathetic. You are so bitterly jealous that you would rather see your own flesh and blood lose everything than lift a single finger to help him. You are entirely worthless to this family, Alyssa. They had spent over 3 decades tearing down my self-esteem, prioritizing my brother and treating me like an unwanted burden. Now they demanded I sacrifice my livelihood to shield him from reality. My father took another aggressive step toward me. I am sick and tired of your disrespect, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You live under the umbrella of this family name, but you contribute absolutely nothing of value. If you will not step up and help your brother when he is fighting for his life, then you are no longer welcome here. Pack whatever garbage you left in your childhood room and get out of my house. I never want to see your ungrateful face again until you learn some respect. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back from his aggressive posture, and I certainly did not shed a single tear. The little girl who used to cry in her bedroom when her parents yelled at her was long gone. In her place sat a woman who held total control over their financial destiny. I slowly picked up my plain, unbranded tote bag from the floor. Jasmine watched me with a victorious smirk, clearly believing that my father had finally put me in my place and that I was preparing to leave in shame. Instead of standing up, I unzipped the bag and reached inside. I pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound securely in a premium leather portfolio. I placed the portfolio firmly on the glass coffee table right in front of Bradley and my furious parents. What is this garbage? My father demanded, glaring at the folder but refusing to touch it. Are these your pathetic little savings accounts? We told you we need real money, not your pocket change. I unclasped the portfolio and spread the notarized documents across the glass surface. The official seals and county property stamps caught the light of the living room chandelier. Your house, I asked calmly, looking directly into my father and his angry eyes. You just told me to get out of your house. I want you to take a very close look at those papers, Dad. Do you remember 3 years ago when your business investments tanked and you defaulted on your mortgage? You were 60 days away from facing a total bank foreclosure and losing this entire property. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the documents on the table. We remember, she said defensively. But your brother stepped up. Bradley used his early startup capital to pay off the bank debt and save our home. He rescued us because he actually cares about this family. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. That is a beautiful story, I said, leaning forward slightly. It is a terrible shame that it is a complete and utter lie. Bradley did not pay off a single cent of your mortgage. He did not have the cash back then, and he certainly does not have it now. Bradley froze, his hands slowly dropping away from his face. He stared at the documents, a new kind of sheer panic washing over his features. When the bank prepared to auction this property, a private limited liability company swept in and bought the debt in full. I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence. Bradley took all the credit, pretending he was your wealthy savior. But he lied to you. He knew exactly who bought the debt because the legal transfer notices were sent to him via certified mail. He hid them from you because he was too much of a coward to admit the truth. My company bought the bank debt. My private equity firm paid off your massive default. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the top deed, pointing directly to the official ownership signature line, printed in bold ink. You have all been blindly living rent-free in my very own house for 3 entire years. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. The air in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. My father Richard stood completely frozen. His hand, which had been pointing aggressively at my face just moments ago, slowly lowered to his side. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks drained away, leaving behind a pale, sickly complexion. He stared at the thick stack of notarized documents resting on his coffee table, as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. My mother Patricia looked physically ill. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting back and forth between the bold black ink of the ownership signature line and my brother Bradley. She was desperately waiting for her golden boy to laugh, to wave a hand and dismiss my claim as a pathetic joke. But Bradley remained entirely silent. He sank deeper into the leather sofa, his eyes glued to the floor, unable to make eye contact with the parents he had actively deceived for 3 years. Jasmine was the first to break the agonizing silence. She stepped forward, her designer heels sinking into the plush rug, and let out a loud theatrical scoff. "This is a complete fabrication," Jasmine sneered, waving her hand dismissively at the portfolio. "Do you honestly expect us to believe this garbage? You probably printed these fake deeds off the internet to scare us." "It is absolutely pathetic, Alyssa. You are so desperate for attention and so wildly jealous of Bradley and his success that you would actually commit forgery just to have a moment in the spotlight. You are completely delusional if you think we are falling for this cheap trick." I did not raise my voice or react to her frantic insults. I simply reached forward and tapped the raised embossed seal on the primary property deed. "I am not asking you to believe anything, Jasmine," I said, keeping my tone perfectly analytical and cold. "These are certified public records. You can log on to the county clerk website right now on your expensive phone and search the parcel number. You will see that the property was legally transferred from the regional bank to Apex Holdings, LLC, 36 months ago. Furthermore, if you pull the state business registry, you will find my name listed as the sole managing member and registered agent of that exact limited liability company. This is not a trick. This is a binding legal reality, and it is entirely verifiable." My father swallowed hard, the sound audible in the tense room. He finally turned his gaze toward my brother. "Bradley." My father croaked, his voice cracking with sudden unfamiliar vulnerability. "Bradley, look at me right now. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you paid off the bank like you promised." Bradley swallowed heavily, his Adam apple bobbing. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy breath came out. He looked at his hands, refusing to meet our father and his desperate gaze. "Dad, I meant to tell you," Bradley mumbled weakly. "I was going to pay it off. I swear I was. But the startup needed capital, and then the LLC stepped in and bought the debt before I could secure the personal funds. I did not know it was Alyssa. I swear I thought it was just some anonymous corporate buyer who forgot to collect rent." My mother gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears of sheer disbelief. "You lied to us," she whispered, staring at Bradley as if he were a complete stranger. "You let us praise you. You let us brag to all our friends about how our successful son saved our home. All this time we have been living under her roof." Jasmine looked frantically between her husband and my parents. Her arrogant facade completely shattered, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. "Wait," Jasmine stammered, her voice shrill. "If she owns the house, what does that mean for us?" "Bradley, what does this mean? It means the free ride is officially over," I stated firmly, standing up from the armchair. I buttoned my plain blazer, moving with deliberate, calm precision. "For 3 years, I allowed you to live here without paying a single dime in rent. I did it because, despite your constant cruelty, I did not want to see my parents thrown out onto the street. I stayed quiet while you mocked my career, insulted my apartment, and belittled my lifestyle. I sat at family dinners and listened to you praise the son who lied to your faces, while you treated the daughter who kept a roof over your heads like a useless burden. I picked up my tote bag and slipped the leather portfolio safely inside. But today you demanded I empty my retirement accounts to fund Bradley and his reckless embezzlement. You told me I contributed absolutely nothing of value to this family. You told me to get out of your house. So I am setting a new boundary." I looked directly at my parents, ensuring they understood the absolute gravity of my words. "Since this is my property, we are going to start doing things my way," I announced, my voice carrying the unyielding authority of a landlord. "You have exactly 30 days to start paying me market rate rent. I will have my attorney draft the standard lease agreement and send it to your email by tomorrow morning. If you fail to sign the lease, or if you miss a single payment, I will serve you with an eviction notice and legally remove you from the premises. Alyssa, you cannot do this to your own parents, my mother sobbed, her hands shaking wildly. Where will we go? We gave all our liquid cash to Bradley. We have nothing left. You should have thought about that before you handed your savings to a fraud, I replied coldly. 30 days. Do not test me. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the front door. Behind me, the living room descended into absolute chaos. My mother began hyperventilating, gasping for air as she collapsed onto the sofa. My father shouted furiously at Bradley, demanding to know where their money went. Jasmine shrieked hysterically, blaming everyone around her for the sudden collapse of their wealthy illusion. I did not stop. I did not look back. I opened the front door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and pulled it firmly shut behind me, locking their toxic panic inside the house I owned. The weekend passed with frantic emails and unread messages from my family. I ignored them all, spending Saturday morning reviewing final audit reports with David in the sanctuary of my penthouse. While my parents grappled with the terrifying reality of their new status as my tenants, my sister-in-law took a completely different approach to the impending financial apocalypse: total unapologetic denial. Jasmine refused to accept that her carefully curated high society life was collapsing. Instead of reining in her spending, she doubled down. She was determined to prove to her elite circle of influencers and wealthy socialites that she and Bradley were still at the absolute top of the food chain. To maintain this fragile illusion, she hosted a lavish catered brunch on Sunday morning at a sprawling rented estate in the Hamptons. She booked the property weeks in advance using the NovaStream corporate card. The event was designed to be a masterclass in conspicuous consumption. I knew the details because the expense reports for the venue, the private chef, the caviar, and the vintage champagne were flagged in the Apex Holdings system. Jasmine was holding court on the manicured lawn, surrounded by 20 of her closest friends. She wore a pristine white designer sundress, her $15,000 handbag resting prominently on the glass patio table. She was laughing loudly, waving her diamond ring in the air, and spinning elaborate lies about Bradley and his massive tech expansions. She told her captivated audience they were buying a vacation home in France, and that NovaStream was preparing for a multi-billion-dollar public offering. She performed the role of the wealthy tech wife, with conviction, desperately trying to outrun the reality of the zero balance in her husband and his frozen bank accounts. At precisely 1 o'clock, my black town car pulled through the wrought iron gates of the rented estate. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal suit. Gone was the plain, unbranded blazer from the birthday dinner. Today, I dressed like the apex predator I was in the boardroom. David stepped out behind me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing the legal documentation we needed for the afternoon. He wore a sharp navy suit and an expression of professional detachment. We did not wait for an invitation. We walked past the hired valet and the confused catering staff, moving with a synchronized, undeniable authority that made people step out of our way automatically. The sound of the string quartet grew louder as we approached the back terrace where the party was in full swing. Jasmine stood at the head of a long, elegantly decorated dining table. She was raising a crystal flute of champagne, preparing to deliver a toast to her gathered friends. To success, to vision, and to never settling for anything less than extraordinary, she proclaimed, her voice carrying across the sunny lawn. Her friends raised their glasses in unison, murmuring their agreement and admiration. That was the exact moment David and I stepped onto the stone patio. The sharp clack of my heels against the flagstone drew the attention of several guests near the back. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as people noticed the severe contrast between our dark corporate attire and the breezy pastel aesthetic of the brunch party. It only took a few seconds for Jasmine to spot me. Her arm froze mid-air, the champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her flute. Her perfect smile morphed instantly into a snarl of genuine outrage. The color rushed to her cheeks as she slammed her glass down on the table. Alyssa, she shouted, completely abandoning her refined high society persona. What in the world are you doing here? The guests turned their heads, their eyes darting back and forth between the angry hostess and the two uninvited strangers. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, letting the awkward silence stretch out for a few seconds. I came to deliver a message, Jasmine, I said calmly, my voice projecting clearly over the fading music. Jasmine let out a harsh, mocking laugh, looking around at her friends to ensure they were watching her handle the situation. A message. Are you out of your mind? You cannot just crash a private event because you are feeling lonely and pathetic. She pointed a manicured finger at my suit. Let me guess you rented that outfit to try and impress my friends. It is not working. You do not belong here. You are completely out of your depth. She turned to a man in a black polo shirt who appeared to be the event manager. Security. She snapped, her voice dripping with entitlement. I need these two people escorted off the property immediately. They are trespassing. This woman is my husband and his estranged sister. She is deeply unstable and she is ruining my event. Remove her right now. The event manager looked hesitant, stepping forward awkwardly. Amy started looking at me. I am going to have to ask you to leave. David stepped smoothly in front of me, opening his leather briefcase with a sharp snap. He pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing the official seal of a federal judge. He handed it directly to the event manager, who took it with a confused frown. We are absolutely not trespassing, David stated, his voice booming with legal authority. We are representatives of Apex Holdings, the primary lien holder of the NovaStream corporate accounts. This event, the catering, the venue, and the staff were all illegally booked using frozen corporate funds. Technically, we own this party. The event manager read the paper, his eyes widening in alarm. He took a quick step back, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal corporate dispute. Jasmine stared at the manager, then back at me, her chest heaving with furious, panicked breaths. Her flawless facade was cracking under the weight of a reality she could no longer deny. She looked at the faces of her wealthy friends, seeing their expressions shift from confusion to a creeping sense of horror. Nobody in high society likes a scandal. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command the space. True power is quiet. It forces everyone else to lean in and listen. I gestured for David to open his briefcase again. He extracted a thick manila folder filled with highlighted bank statements, credit card ledgers, and signed expense reports. I took the folder and held it up for the entire patio to see. Jasmine, you have spent the entire morning bragging to these people about your luxurious lifestyle, I said, my voice steady and clear. You called me pathetic. You told everyone I was out of my depth. But let us talk about the depth of your illusion. Let us perform a little financial autopsy right here on the lawn. Jasmine crossed her arms, trying to physically shield herself. You are crazy, she spat, her voice trembling. Bradley is a successful chief executive officer. We are building an empire. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. I held up a color copy of a receipt. That $15,000 Hermes bag resting on the table behind you is absolutely stunning, I noted dryly. It is a shame Bradley did not buy it with his own salary. He bought it using the NovaStream corporate credit card on Tuesday afternoon. He classified it as a marketing promotional expense. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites. Jasmine instinctively reached backward, her hand grazing the expensive leather of the handbag. I pulled out a second document. The Tesla Model S parked in the VIP spot outside is not yours. The lease was executed under the NovaStream corporate identity, completely violating the terms of our investment agreement. And this lavish brunch, the private chef, the vintage champagne you just toasted with. Every single cent was charged to a company account that was explicitly designated for software development and employee payroll. Bradley did not earn this lifestyle. He stole it. He bought it using corporate funds, and those funds belonged entirely to my private equity firm. The guests began to step away from Jasmine. The social contagion of her fraud was palpable. They looked at the caviar and champagne as if it were suddenly poisoned. Jasmine shook her head violently, her perfect microbraids swaying. "You are lying!" Jasmine shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are just a bitter junior analyst making up stories because you are jealous." Bradley raised $5 million from a major private equity firm. They believe in his vision. They believed in his financial projections. I corrected her smoothly. But they stopped believing the moment they audited his ledgers over the weekend. And I would know better than anyone, Jasmine. Because I do not just work at Apex Holdings, I founded it, I own it. I am the private equity firm that funded your husband, and I am the person who just froze his accounts and reported him for fraud. Jasmine lost her balance, stumbling backward until her hip hit the edge of the dining table. The champagne flutes rattled dangerously. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, unbranded sister-in-law she had mocked and belittled was actually the billionaire holding the leash to her entire existence. But I was not finished. The financial autopsy was only the beginning. It was time for the social execution. You see, Jasmine, corporate embezzlement is not just a problem for the chief executive officer, I explained, pulling a final set of papers from the folder. Especially when the spouse decides to actively participate in the fraud. I reviewed the NovaStream corporate ledgers last night. Bradley did not just hand you a company credit card, he officially listed you as a corporate consultant to justify your lavish travel expenses and luxury purchases. I took a slow step closer, making sure every single one of her wealthy friends could hear the exact legal ramifications of her vanity. Do you know what happens when you sign your name on fraudulent corporate expense reports? I asked, letting the question hang in the silent air. The Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission take a very specific view on that. By signing those receipts and accepting those consultant fees without rendering any actual business services, you are no longer just a spoiled wife enjoying the spoils of a rich husband. Jasmine stared at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "What are you saying?" She breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I am saying you are legally complicit," I stated coldly. "Under federal compliance laws, your signature on those documents makes you an active participant in corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. You did not just spend stolen money, Jasmine. You helped steal it. You conspired to defraud an investment firm." The crowd of influencers and socialites physically recoiled. Whispers broke out among the guests, the words federal fraud and embezzlement buzzing like a disturbed hive of bees. In the world of high society, bankruptcy is a tragedy, but federal criminal charges are an absolute plague. Nobody wants their name associated with a federal indictment. Nobody wants to be subpoenaed to testify about a stolen Hermes bag at a fraudulent brunch. One by one, Jasmine watched her closest friends quietly set down their champagne glasses. They did not say goodbye. They did not offer words of comfort. They simply turned their backs on her and began walking quickly toward the estate exit, desperate to get to the valet and escape the blast radius of her impending legal destruction. The exodus was not just rapid, it was absolutely brutal. Women who had been air-kissing Jasmine on the cheeks 10 minutes ago now avoided eye contact entirely. The soft chatter of the elegant brunch died, completely replaced by the hurried crunch of designer shoes on the gravel path. Jasmine reached out, grabbing the arm of a woman in a floral silk dress. "Wait! Olivia, please!" Jasmine begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "It is a misunderstanding. You know Bradley. You know us." Olivia gently but firmly pried Jasmine and her fingers off her arm. "I am sorry, Jasmine," Olivia said, her tone devoid of any previous warmth. "But my husband sits on the board of 3 public companies. We cannot be near a federal financial dispute. I need to leave right now." Olivia turned and sprinted toward the front gates. Jasmine watched her go, her arms falling uselessly. The remaining guests followed suit, abandoning plates of expensive food and half-empty glasses. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The silence over the sprawling rented estate was deafening. That absolute silence was shattered by the loud rumble of a diesel engine groaning up the paved driveway. The departing guests paused near the wrought iron gates as a massive flatbed tow truck pulled directly onto the property. Behind the tow truck, two unmarked black sport utility vehicles parked aggressively blocking the exit. Four men in dark tactical vests stepped out. They were highly specialized private asset recovery agents contracted directly by Apex Holdings. David gave them a brief nod of authorization. The lead agent bypassed the confused valet staff and walked directly toward the VIP parking area where Bradley had proudly displayed the brand new Tesla Model S. Jasmine gasped, snapping out of her frozen shock. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, hiking up her white designer sundress and sprinting across the manicured lawn toward the driveway. "Hey, get away from that car. You cannot touch that. That belongs to my husband." The lead agent ignored her protests, completely dropping to his knees and attaching a heavy steel winch to the undercarriage of the luxury electric vehicle. Jasmine physically threw herself between the tow truck operator and the driver's side door, acting as a human shield. "I am calling the police right now," she screamed, her micro braids coming undone in her frantic movements. "You are stealing my car." David stepped forward smoothly, pulling another legal document from his briefcase and placing it directly into her trembling hands. "We are not stealing anything," Jasmine David stated with absolute authority. "We are repossessing corporate property. This mandate was signed by a federal judge at 9 o'clock this morning. It authorizes Apex Holdings to seize any physical assets purchased with misappropriated NovaStream funds. Since Bradley used our capital to lease this vehicle, it belongs entirely to the firm. Step away from the car, or these agents will have you removed for obstructing a court-ordered repossession." Jasmine looked at the paper, the heavy legal jargon blurring before her tear-filled eyes. She stumbled backward in defeat, leaning heavily against a decorative stone pillar. The mechanical whine of the tow truck gears filled the air as the $100,000 car was dragged unceremoniously onto the flatbed. But the recovery agents were not finished. The lead officer walked directly up to Jasmine, holding out a large, clear evidence bag. "Ma'am," he said, his voice entirely professional and devoid of sympathy. "According to our manifest, you are currently in possession of a Birkin handbag purchased on Tuesday with stolen corporate funds. I need you to hand it over immediately." Jasmine clutched the $15,000 bag to her chest. "No," she sobbed, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks. "No, this is mine. It was a personal gift. It is a piece of material evidence," I corrected her, stepping up beside David. "And if you refuse to surrender it, you are tampering with stolen corporate property. Hand it over right now, Jasmine. You have already lost the luxury car and all of your superficial friends. Do not add obstruction of justice to your rapidly growing list of legal problems." Defeated and humiliated, Jasmine slowly unlaced her fingers from the leather handle. She dropped the bag into the plastic evidence sack. The agent sealed it tightly and walked back to the convoy. The tow truck shifted into gear, hauling the physical proof of her fake wealth down the driveway and out of sight. The last of her high society friends quickly slipped out behind the trucks, desperate to escape the toxic scene. Even the event caterers began hastily packing up their equipment, realizing the hosts were bankrupt and their final invoices would never be paid. Jasmine stood totally alone on the lawn of a house she did not own, stripped of her car, her luxury accessories, and her entire social circle. She reached into the pocket of her sundress with trembling hands and pulled out her smartphone. She bypassed her messages and dialed Bradley directly. I watched as she pressed the phone to her ear, her entire body shaking with fear and pure rage. Bradley answered on the second ring. Before he could even speak a single word, Jasmine unleashed a primal, furious scream. "You lied to me," she shrieked into the receiver. "You told me you were a massive success. You told me you raised $5 million. They took the car, Bradley. They took my bag. They took everything right in front of all my friends. You are a fraud. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke fraud who used me to play pretend. You dragged me into federal embezzlement, you coward. Tell me right now, do we have any money left? Tell me the actual truth. I listened as Bradley stammered desperately. The grand illusion was dead. I nodded to David, turning away. We had completely achieved our goal. Jasmine was stranded alone in the ruins of her vanity. I nodded to David and turned away. Jasmine was stranded alone in the ruins of her vanity. Back in the city, Bradley experienced a different kind of destruction. The walls of his glass office felt like they were closing in on him. His phone rang incessantly with calls from furious investors, aggressive debt collectors, and his irate broker. The margin call deadline had passed. His personal assets were currently being systematically liquidated by the bank. However, those assets were nowhere near enough to cover the massive deficit he created. He knew that by the end of the week, authorities would begin looking into the gross discrepancies in the NovaStream ledgers. Embezzlement was a serious charge, and he was staring directly at a lengthy prison sentence. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Bradley was completely cornered. Stripped of his arrogance and his stolen wealth, he reverted to sheer survival instinct. He realized fighting Apex Holdings in court was impossible. He had absolutely no capital left to hire a defense attorney. His only option was to run, but running required cash. Untraceable, immediate cash. That was when he made the most catastrophic decision of his entire life. Bradley locked his office door and pulled the blinds down. He logged into the secure developer servers of NovaStream. The only thing of actual value left in the company was the proprietary source code. It was a highly advanced algorithm his lead engineers had spent 2 years building. It was the core intellectual property making the company valuable. Bradley inserted an encrypted hard drive into his computer and began downloading the entire repository. He was stealing the core asset of the company he bankrupted. He picked up his cell phone and dialed a private number. He called the chief executive officer of a rival tech firm, a man known for ruthless and unethical business practices. Bradley offered him a deal that sounded too good to be true. He offered to sell the complete unencrypted NovaStream source code for a flat fee of $250,000 in cash, wired to an offshore account. It was a mere fraction of what the intellectual property was actually worth. Bradley did not care about market value anymore. He only cared about securing enough capital to disappear. He needed to flee the state, escape federal jurisdiction, and start over somewhere they could not extradite him. The rival executive agreed to the illegal purchase, sensing a desperate man willing to part with gold for pennies. They arranged to finalize the digital transfer and sign the contract the following day. But Bradley had a glaring logistical problem. His credit cards were completely frozen. He had no way to book an international flight, secure a temporary safe house, or even pay for gas. Predictably, he turned to the only two people who had never held him accountable for his actions. He drove straight to our parents' house. When Bradley burst through their front door sweating and frantically explaining he needed to leave the country immediately, Patricia and Richard did not ask him to turn himself in. They did not question the morality of him abandoning his failing company, mounting debts, or even his wife. Instead, they embraced his delusional narrative. They truly believed I was a vicious monster who had orchestrated this crisis out of pure jealousy. To them, Bradley was a persecuted genius, and I was the villain forcing him into a tragic exile. With their bank accounts drained from previous attempts to help him, my parents resorted to desperation. Patricia went into her bedroom and emptied her jewelry box. She took out her diamond anniversary necklace, her platinum tennis bracelet, and every piece of heirloom gold she possessed. Richard removed the vintage Rolex from his wrist. Together they drove to a high-end pawnshop downtown and liquidated their retirement jewelry for a fraction of its appraised value. They handed the stack of crisp $100 bills directly to Bradley, fully financing his escape plan. That evening, I sat at my desk in the penthouse watching the city skyline glow. My phone began to vibrate on the mahogany surface. It was a call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, my father called. I ignored that one as well. Over the next hour, they left a series of voicemails encapsulating their blind, toxic loyalty. I pressed play on the first message. My mother was sobbing hysterically, her voice shrill and laced with venom. "Alyssa, you are a soulless monster," she screamed. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? You are forcing your brother to leave his home. You have destroyed his life because you could never handle being second best. You are a cold, bitter woman, and I deeply regret the day I brought you into this world." The next voicemail was from my father. His voice shook with unrestrained fury. "You think you have won, Alyssa," he threatened. "You think your money makes you powerful. We just gave Bradley everything he needs to get away from your psycho corporate attacks. He is going to rebuild, and he is going to be 10 times more successful than you will ever be. You are dead to us. Do not ever try to contact this family again." I sat in the quiet luxury of my office listening to the recorded sounds of their hatred. They genuinely believed they had saved him. They thought pawning jewelry to buy his plane tickets was a noble parental sacrifice. They thought Bradley was escaping to fight another day. They had no idea his desperate attempt to sell the company source code was not an escape hatch. It was a federal trap, and he was walking right into it. I deleted the long voicemails, took a slow sip of my sparkling water, and opened my laptop to monitor the digital tripwires my legal team had successfully established. The dangerous game was far from over. The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when David walked into my penthouse office on Friday morning. He held a sleek silver tablet and wore an expression of intense focus. The digital tripwires we established on the NovaStream developer servers had been triggered late last night. When my firm provided the $5 million capital injection, we legally required administrative access to their entire digital infrastructure as a basic security measure. Bradley was far too arrogant and technologically illiterate to realize that his every keystroke on a company device was routed through our compliance monitoring software. He believed he was executing a brilliant, untraceable corporate heist under the cover of darkness. In reality, he was broadcasting his exact criminal intentions directly to my security team in real time. David placed the tablet on my mahogany desk and swiped the screen to open a detailed forensic log. "He took the bait," David said, pointing to a series of highlighted data transfers. At approximately 11 o'clock last night, Bradley bypassed the standard firewall and initiated a massive download from the core proprietary repository. He transferred the entire unencrypted source code onto a portable external hard drive. Immediately after the transfer was complete, he utilized a secure messaging application on his corporate laptop to contact the chief executive officer of a rival technology firm. He offered to sell the complete intellectual property for a lump sum of $250,000, requesting the funds be wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I calmly leaned forward and reviewed the intercepted digital communications on the screen. The rival executive had enthusiastically agreed to the illicit terms, scheduling a digital contract signing for late this afternoon. Bradley also used a private web browser to search for international flights to non-extradition countries, confirming my parents successfully provided him the cash to facilitate his escape. He planned to execute the sale, verify the wire transfer, and board a plane by midnight. David crossed his arms, his legal instincts kicking into high gear. "This is a severe breach of his non-disclosure agreement and a direct violation of our ownership rights," David stated firmly. "The source code is the only remaining asset of value within NovaStream. If he transfers that code to a competitor, it could cause irreparable damage to the market valuation of the intellectual property. I can draft an emergency injunction right now. We can file it with a federal judge before noon, dispatch law enforcement to his physical location, and seize the hard drive before he has the opportunity to sign the contract or execute the digital handover. We can stop this right in its tracks." I looked away from the glowing screen of the tablet and stared out the window at the sprawling financial district below. A soft, cold smile spread across my face. The urge to immediately crush my brother was strong, but I was playing a much longer and far more permanent game. I did not just want to stop him from making a mistake. I wanted to permanently remove his ability to ever harm me or my business again. No, I said quietly, my voice carrying absolute certainty. Do not file the injunction. Call off the lawyers and instruct the cybersecurity team to stand down. David furrowed his brow, clearly surprised by my directive. Alyssa, if we let him proceed, he is going to hand over proprietary assets. We are risking the core technology. Why would we give him the opportunity to complete the transaction? I turned my chair to face David directly. Let him sign the contract, I commanded, leaning back and resting my hands on the armrests. Right now, Bradley is guilty of severe corporate negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and basic embezzlement. Those are serious charges, but with a clever defense attorney and a sob story about a failing startup, he might negotiate a plea deal and avoid serious prison time. He could walk away with probation and a financial penalty that our parents would foolishly spend the rest of their miserable lives trying to pay off. But the moment he signs a contract to sell intellectual property, he does not legally own. The entire paradigm shifts. I pointed to the forensic logs on the tablet. The non-disclosure agreement and the equity covenants he signed explicitly state that Apex Holdings retains sole ownership of all intellectual property in the event of a corporate default. He knows this. By crossing state and international lines to sell stolen proprietary technology via electronic communication, his crime immediately upgrades from corporate negligence to federal wire fraud and corporate espionage. The Department of Justice does not offer lenient plea deals for premeditated corporate espionage. If we stop him now, he is just a desperate failing businessman. If we let him sign that contract, he becomes a federal felon. Let him dig his own grave. David slowly nodded his head, a look of profound professional respect crossing his features. He immediately recognized the ruthless logic of my strategy. The trap was not designed to catch Bradley in the act of planning a crime. The trap was designed to let him fully execute it, ensuring there would be absolutely no legal loopholes or escape routes available to him when the hammer finally fell. We spent the rest of the morning monitoring his digital footprint with clinical precision. Our security analysts tracked his location using the GPS chip embedded in his corporate phone. We watched the cursor move across his screen as he drafted his resignation letter, prepared the encrypted file transfers, and finalized the offshore banking details. Every single keystroke was logged, time-stamped, and securely backed up to our own servers to be used as irrefutable evidence in a federal court. Bradley thought he was a mastermind pulling off the ultimate escape. He had absolutely no idea he was just a rat running through a carefully constructed maze, heading blindly toward a perfectly placed guillotine. While Bradley typed away in his office, his perfectly constructed maze was already crumbling from the inside. The fatal blow to his escape plan did not come from my cybersecurity team or federal agents. It came from the very woman he had brought into the scheme. Jasmine sat in the living room of their leased mansion, surrounded by the remnants of her shattered social life. Her phone remained completely silent. The elite socialites who usually flooded her notifications had blocked her number. The sheer reality of my warning at the brunch was finally sinking into her mind. She was legally complicit in corporate embezzlement. Desperation makes people incredibly observant. Jasmine paced the master bedroom, her anxiety mounting with every passing hour. Bradley had been acting erratic since returning from my parents' house with the pawn shop cash. He told her he was working on a secret legal strategy to save them both and instructed her to pack a small bag for a temporary relocation. Jasmine opened his walk-in closet to grab his leather duffel bag. As she pulled it down from the top shelf, a thick manila envelope fell to the floor. The metal clasp popped open, spilling its contents across the expensive hardwood. Jasmine knelt down to gather the papers, but her hands froze. It was a printed travel itinerary. She scanned the bold ink, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The itinerary detailed a first-class one-way ticket departing that night at 11:45. The destination was a jurisdiction in the Middle East with notoriously strict policies against extraditing financial criminals back to the United States. She frantically flipped through the rest of the documents. There was a newly expedited passport, offshore banking transfer confirmation codes, and a fake corporate alias. There was only one ticket. The truth hit Jasmine with the devastating force of a physical strike. Bradley was not formulating a legal defense. He was not planning a temporary relocation for the two of them. He was using the cash our parents blindly provided to fund a solo escape. He was going to board an international flight and disappear into the night, leaving her behind to face the full, unyielding wrath of the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission entirely alone. He was offering her up as the sacrificial lamb to absorb the federal embezzlement charges while he lived comfortably. Her initial shock instantly dissolved into a white-hot, venomous rage. Jasmine was vain, materialistic, and condescending, but she was definitely not stupid. She remembered every single word I had spoken to her at the rented estate. I had laid out her exact legal exposure. She knew that if Bradley vanished, the federal investigators would immediately target the spouse whose signature was all over the fraudulent consultant expense reports. She would be the one standing in a courtroom. She would be the one going to a federal penitentiary. Jasmine stood up, her jaw clenched tight. She refused to fall. She was not going to let her cowardly husband throw her under the bus to save his own skin. If the ship was sinking, she was going to make absolutely sure she had a lifeboat. She walked directly to Bradley and his private study. She knew exactly where he kept his true financial secrets. Bradley always thought he was smarter than everyone else, but his arrogance made him sloppy. He kept a physical encrypted hard drive hidden in a hollowed-out book on the bottom shelf of his bookcase. It contained the unedited off-the-books ledgers. It held the digital receipts for every illicit transfer, every fake shell company invoice, and every single dollar he had actively embezzled from NovaStream before the audit caught him. Jasmine grabbed the hard drive, shoved it into her coat pocket, and pulled out her smartphone. She went straight to the top of the food chain. She pulled up the legal notice David had handed her during the brunch and dialed the direct contact number for the Apex Holdings legal department. David was sitting across from me in the penthouse when his private line rang loudly. He answered, putting it on speakerphone so I could hear. "I know about the intellectual property sale," Jasmine said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and pure fury. "I know he is planning to sell the NovaStream code today, and I know he bought a one-way ticket out of the country for tonight. He is trying to abandon me. He is trying to leave me to take the fall for the embezzlement." David looked at me, a highly amused expression crossing his face. "And how exactly does this concern Apex Holdings, Jasmine?" "I want a deal," she demanded fiercely. "I want full ironclad immunity. I want a signed agreement stating that Apex Holdings will not pursue civil or criminal charges against me. In exchange, I will give you the smoking gun. I have Bradley and his hidden encrypted hard drive. It proves he orchestrated the entire fraud himself and deliberately misled me." I leaned toward the speakerphone, a slow, satisfied smile forming on my lips. "Bring the hard drive to the downtown office in exactly 30 minutes, I instructed her calmly. "Do not alert Bradley. We will draft a non-prosecution agreement protecting you from civil liability." "I will be there," Jasmine replied breathlessly. The line clicked dead. We took the private elevator down to the corporate office levels. 30 minutes later, Jasmine walked through the glass doors. She looked entirely terrified, deeply exhausted, and desperately eager to save herself today. She slid the heavy encrypted hard drive across the long polished conference table directly to David. David quickly handed her the freshly printed non-prosecution agreement. Jasmine quickly signed the important document without a single moment of hesitation, officially betraying her husband and handing over the unassailable proof of his extensive financial crimes. The ultimate backstab was complete. Bradley was completely isolated, totally unaware of his impending doom. Bradley was completely isolated, totally unaware of his impending doom. He spent Friday afternoon pacing his luxurious office, entirely convinced he was the smartest man in the city. The digital transfer of the proprietary source code had finished processing just an hour prior. The rival tech executive had confirmed receipt of the files and initiated the offshore wire transfer of $250,000. Bradley checked his secret banking app and saw the pending deposit. In his highly arrogant mind, he had executed the perfect corporate escape. He had the cash. He had his first-class plane ticket for tonight. All that was left was to officially drop the burning wreckage of NovaStream directly into the lap of Apex Holdings. To finalize his grand exit, Bradley called an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 3 o'clock. Of course, the board currently consisted only of himself and the primary investor representative, which was David. But Bradley did not want to face this final moment alone. He craved a captive audience for his perceived victory. He wanted witnesses to watch him outsmart the ruthless private equity firm that dared to audit him. So he brought Patricia and Richard. Our parents arrived at the corporate headquarters, walking with an unearned sense of absolute superiority. They strutted past the few remaining NovaStream employees, who were quietly packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The staff had not received their paychecks, but my parents did not care about the ruined livelihoods of the working class. They only cared about protecting their golden boy. Richard patted Bradley on the back, offering loud words of encouragement. Patricia smoothed the collar of Bradley and his expensive suit jacket, telling him how incredibly brave he was for standing up to the corporate bullies. They had absolutely no idea that their son was preparing to commit federal wire fraud. They simply thought he was utilizing a clever legal loophole to declare bankruptcy and walk away from his debts, leaving me and my firm to absorb the massive financial loss. They entered the main glass-walled boardroom. The long table was constructed from a single slab of imported walnut. Bradley took his seat at the head of the table, leaning back and crossing his arms with a deeply smug expression. Patricia sat to his immediate right, and Richard sat to his left. They formed a united toxic front. They were ready to watch Bradley deliver a fatal blow to the firm that had frozen his stolen wealth. At precisely 3 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. David walked in alone. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried nothing but a slim black leather briefcase. He did not look angry. He did not look panicked. He looked entirely bored, possessing the calm demeanor of a man who already knew the final score of the game. David took a seat at the opposite end of the long table, placing his briefcase flat on the polished wood. He folded his hands together and simply waited for Bradley to speak. Bradley let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked at my parents, shaking his head as if David were a pathetic joke. "Well," David Bradley began, his voice dripping with unrestrained arrogance, "I hope you came here today ready to accept reality. I called this emergency meeting to officially inform Apex Holdings that NovaStream is functionally insolvent. We have zero liquid capital. We have zero operational capacity. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer and filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection." Richard nodded approvingly, folding his arms across his chest. "That is right," my father chimed in loudly. "You corporate vultures tried to ruin my son with your aggressive account freezes. You tried to starve his company. Now you get to deal with the consequences of your own greed. You pushed him into a corner, and now your $5 million investment is completely worthless." Patricia smiled a cold, victorious smile. "My son is a brilliant entrepreneur," she added, her voice laced with venom. "He is going to walk out of this building, start a brand new venture, and leave you holding an empty bag. You people seriously underestimated his intelligence and his resilience." David did not react to the parents and their foolish taunts. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Bradley. "Is that your official position, Bradley?" David asked in a smooth, unbothered tone. "You are declaring bankruptcy and walking away from your legal fiduciary obligations." "That is exactly what I am doing," Bradley declared, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Startups fail every single day, David. It is just the harsh nature of the technology business. You took a risk when you funded me. Now that risk has unfortunately materialized. You can take the remaining company assets and liquidate them if you want. Sell the office furniture. Sell the computer monitors. I frankly do not care. I am washing my hands of this entire situation. Bradley paused, letting a wide, arrogant grin spread across his face. He believed he had executed a flawless checkmate. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered a billionaire investment firm. He felt invincible. He looked at David with utter disdain, disgusted by the calm professionalism the lawyer maintained. "You know, David, I am honestly tired of this conversation," Bradley sneered, waving his hand dismissively. "I am tired of dealing with a corporate stooge. You are nothing but a messenger boy wearing a nice suit. You sit there acting tough, but you are just an employee. I am a founder. I am a visionary. I built this company from the ground up, and I am the one deciding how it ends." David remained perfectly silent, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. His absolute silence only infuriated Bradley further. The arrogant golden child was so used to people cowering in fear before his manufactured anger. He desperately wanted a satisfying reaction. He wanted the highly paid representative of Apex Holdings to sweat to beg to show some definitive sign of defeat. "I am done dealing with the middleman," Bradley barked, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls of the quiet boardroom. "Bring in the chairman of Apex Holdings. I want to look this coward in the eye." The echo of Bradley and his demand hung in the air for a brief, tense moment. David did not even flinch. He did not look intimidated or offended by the sheer disrespect thrown in his direction. Instead, a slow and highly satisfied smile crept across his face. He calmly reached deep into his tailored jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and tapped the screen exactly once. He placed the phone back into his pocket and folded his hands together again, looking directly at Bradley. "Be very careful what you ask for," David said softly. "You might just get it." Right on cue, the heavy frosted glass double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. The polished metal hinges glided silently, but the visual impact was akin to a bomb detonating inside the room. I walked through the threshold. The oversized, unbranded cheap blazer from the Michelin star restaurant was completely gone. In its place, I wore a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal suit tailored to absolute perfection by one of the most exclusive designers in Milan. The cut was immaculate, projecting an aura of sheer, unadulterated power. A limited edition Patek Philippe watch rested elegantly on my left wrist, catching the overhead boardroom lights and flashing a subtle but undeniable signal of immense wealth. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely devoid of emotion, and my footsteps echoed with rhythmic, terrifying authority against the polished hardwood floor. In my right hand, I carried a small object. It was a custom-made elegant glass and mahogany display case. Resting perfectly centered inside the protective glass was a single crisp $20 bill. It was the exact same piece of currency Bradley had violently thrown at my chest just a few nights ago when he laughed and told me I could not even afford a cup of coffee. I made sure it was polished to absolute perfection before bringing it here today. I walked slowly down the length of the massive walnut table. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my father. I could feel their eyes burning into the side of my face, their minds completely failing to process the visual information in front of them. Patricia sat frozen in her expensive chair, her mouth hanging slightly open as she took in the tailored suit and the commanding presence of the daughter she had ruthlessly mocked for 33 years. Richard blinked rapidly, gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. They were entirely paralyzed by a reality that shattered their deeply ingrained toxic worldview. I bypassed their side of the table entirely. I walked directly to the opposite end, right next to where David was seated. There was one heavy, high-backed leather chair positioned there. It was the seat universally reserved for the highest-ranking executive in the room. I pulled the chair out smoothly and sat down, crossing my legs with calculated grace. I placed the small glass display case directly in the center of the table, positioning it so the $20 bill faced my brother. I folded my hands on the smooth walnut surface and simply looked at him. For 10 agonizing seconds, the boardroom was plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. You could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning system. Bradley stared at me. His eyes darted from the bespoke suit to the luxury watch, and finally down to the framed $20 bill resting on the table. His brain violently rejected the sequence of events. The cognitive dissonance was simply too massive for his fragile, arrogant ego to handle. He had spent his entire life viewing me as a pathetic, invisible loser. Seeing me sitting in the seat of power, radiating wealth and absolute authority, short-circuited his mind. The shock finally broke. Bradley lost his mind. He sprang up from his chair so violently that it tipped backward and crashed loudly against the glass wall behind him. He slammed both of his hands down flat onto the walnut table, leaning forward with his face contorted in sheer, unadulterated rage. He glared at me. "What the hell are you doing here?" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and sudden, inexplicable panic. "Get out! Get out right now! You are just a junior risk analyst. You have absolutely no business being in this room. This is a private corporate meeting." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I sat perfectly still, observing his total meltdown with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a frantic lab rat. It was truly pathetic. My father suddenly found his voice. He stood up, pointing a finger in my direction. "Alyssa, what is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, trying to project his usual paternal dominance but failing miserably. "Are you working for these people? Did they send you to spy on your own brother? Have you been feeding them information about his startup? I told you to get out of my house, and now you have the audacity to show up at his company and humiliate him." My mother joined the chorus, her voice shrill and panicked. "You are a traitor!" Patricia shrieked, clutching her pearls. "You are a vindictive girl. You begged this firm for a job just so you could sabotage him. Get out of his building before we call security and have you dragged into the street." Bradley continued to slam his hands on the table, his chest heaving for air. He looked at David, his eyes wild and desperate. "Is this your idea of a very sick joke?" Bradley yelled loudly. "You bring my estranged sister in here to mock me while I am filing for bankruptcy. I demanded to see the chairman of Apex Holdings. I demanded to see the person who ruined me. I will not speak until the head of your firm walks through those doors and faces me." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool walnut surface. The sheer desperation in his voice was the exact melody I had waited years to hear. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. My voice was dead calm, cutting through the heavy air of the boardroom like a scalpel. "I am a risk analyst, Bradley," I said, enunciating every single syllable. "And you were the biggest financial risk I ever analyzed. I founded Apex Holdings 5 years ago. Welcome to my firm." The words landed with the impact of a physical blow. Bradley stood frozen, his chest heaving rapidly. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked wildly at David, expecting the lawyer to burst into laughter, to confirm this was all an elaborate prank to humiliate him before the real executives arrived. David simply adjusted his cuffs and offered a single affirming nod. "She is the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole majority shareholder of Apex Holdings," David stated clearly. "You are standing in her building, breathing her air, and burning her capital." My father, Richard, practically collapsed backward into his leather chair. The aggressive posture he had maintained for decades instantly evaporated. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a terrifying, translucent shade of gray. He stared at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a mythical creature right in front of his eyes. "You," my father stammered, his voice barely a hollow whisper, "you are the private equity firm. You are the billionaire." "Yes, Dad," I replied, keeping my posture completely relaxed. "While you were busy praising Bradley for his supposed genius, I was quietly building a financial empire. While you were mocking my old Honda Civic and my plain clothes, I was acquiring commercial real estate, funding tech startups, and managing billions in assets. I did not need your validation or your approval to succeed. I just needed you to leave me alone so I could work. Bradley gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head violently, desperately trying to reject reality. No, he gasped, his voice trembling with sheer terror. No, this is impossible. You do not have the brains for this. You are just a quiet, boring girl. How could you fund my entire Series A round without me knowing? How could you trick me like this? I did not trick you, Bradley, I said smoothly. You tricked yourself. Your ego is so massive and your business acumen is so incredibly fragile that you never bothered to do basic due diligence. You never questioned why a major investment firm handed you $5 million with almost zero pushback. You never looked past the front-facing executives to see who actually controlled the capital. You just saw a giant check and assumed the universe was finally rewarding your imaginary brilliance. I gestured toward the framed $20 bill resting on the table. You threw this money at me because you thought I was destitute, I continued. You wanted to humiliate me in front of our parents and your greedy wife. But the reality is that every single dollar you have spent over the last 6 months belonged to me. The luxury dinners, the designer clothes, the leased cars. You were playing the role of a wealthy tech titan using your little sister and her wallet. My mother, Patricia, began to hyperventilate. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair with a desperate clawing intensity. She looked at the bespoke suit I was wearing then, at the limited edition watch on my wrist, and finally at the imposing boardroom around us. Her entire worldview, a universe where Bradley was the ultimate winner and I was the eternal loser, was violently shattering into a million jagged pieces. The cognitive dissonance was physically breaking her down. Alyssa, my mother gasped, her breathing becoming dangerously shallow. You did this to us on purpose. You set your own brother up to fail. You laid a trap to destroy him. I shook my head slowly. I did not set him up to fail, Mom. I gave him exactly what he asked for. I gave him $5 million of capital to build his company. I gave him the opportunity to prove he was the genius you always claimed he was. If he had actually used that money to develop software, pay his employees, and grow the business, we would not be having this conversation. NovaStream would be a thriving asset in my portfolio, but he could not do it. He could not resist the urge to steal. He could not resist the urge to embezzle my money to fund his fake, flashy lifestyle. He destroyed his own company. I am just the person holding the receipts. The undeniable truth of my words struck my parents like a freight train. They had pawned their retirement jewelry. They had drained their savings. They had sacrificed their entire financial future to protect a son who was actively stealing from their estranged, highly successful daughter. The colossal magnitude of their mistake was incomprehensible. Patricia let out a high, thin wail. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her body suddenly went completely limp. She slumped sideways, literally fainting into the deep leather of her boardroom chair. Patricia, my father shouted, jumping up and rushing to her side. He frantically patted her cheeks, trying to rouse her from the shock-induced blackout. Someone get a doctor. Help her. I did not move a single muscle. I sat in my high-backed chairman's seat, watching the chaotic scene unfold with absolute chilling detachment. David remained perfectly still beside me, awaiting my next command. Bradley stared at our unconscious mother, then slowly raised his terrified eyes to meet mine. He was looking for a shred of sympathy, a glimmer of the sisterly bond he had ruthlessly exploited and mocked for his entire life. He found absolutely nothing. There was no warmth left in me. There was only the cold, hard reality of the boardroom. She will be fine, I said flatly, glancing at my mother. It is just a minor panic attack caused by the sudden realization of her own monumental stupidity. She will wake up in a few minutes to face the consequences of her actions. But right now, Bradley, we need to talk about your consequences. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a fresh, unsealed folder. I slid it across the smooth walnut table. It stopped precisely in front of him. You thought you could declare bankruptcy and walk away from my firm today. You thought you were outsmarting the system. But you made one final fatal mistake last night, and now I am going to make you pay for it. Bradley stared at the unsealed folder resting on the walnut table. His hands trembled violently as he flipped it open. Inside lay a crisp printout of the digital contract he had executed hours ago. It was the agreement to sell the NovaStream source code for $250,000. Attached were the forensic logs of his secure messaging history, time-stamped down to the exact millisecond of his illegal transmission. His eyes widened in sheer panic. "How did you get this?" he breathed, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his downfall. "That was on a secure, encrypted server. You used a company laptop connected to a network funded entirely by my firm," I explained, leaning back. "When Apex Holdings injected $5 million into NovaStream, our agreement mandated complete administrative access. We installed compliance software on day one. You thought you were executing a brilliant heist in the shadows. In reality, my cybersecurity team watched your every keystroke. We watched you download the proprietary code. We read every message to your buyer. We tracked your offshore bank account setup. We even watched you search for one-way plane tickets using the cash Mom and Dad pawned their retirement jewelry to provide." My father gasped, stepping away from my mother, who was beginning to stir from her fainting spell. Richard looked at his son with complete devastation. "You were going to run?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with betrayal. "We gave you everything, and you were going to abandon us." Bradley ignored our father. His survival instincts blinded him to everything except the terrifying documents. "But the encryption," Bradley stammered, looking frantically at David, then back to me. "You still do not have the off-the-books ledgers. You cannot prove the embezzlement without my private hard drive. It is hidden where you will never find it." I smiled warmly. "You mean the encrypted hard drive you kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on the bottom shelf of your home office?" I asked. Bradley froze completely. I reached into my bespoke suit jacket and pulled out a small rectangular object. I placed the encrypted hard drive gently on top of the printed contract. Bradley stared at it as if it were a live grenade on the table. "You made a critical error in your escape plan," I continued, my voice smooth. "You booked a single first-class ticket. You planned to leave your wife behind to face the federal government for the fraudulent expense reports she signed. But Jasmine is a survivor. When she found your hidden itinerary, she realized you were throwing her under the bus. So she decided to drive the bus herself. She brought this hard drive directly to my office yesterday. She traded your entire financial life for a non-prosecution agreement. She secured legal immunity by handing us the smoking gun guaranteeing your destruction. Your wife sold you out without hesitation." Bradley let out a guttural, wounded sound. It was a pathetic whimper of a man realizing he had been completely outplayed on every conceivable level. The people he manipulated had turned against him. The wealth he flaunted was a complete illusion. The company he claimed to build was a trap designed by the sister he despised. "You just sold intellectual property that legally belongs to Apex Holdings," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow. "You executed a wire transfer across international lines for stolen assets. That is not just corporate negligence, that is a federal crime. You committed wire fraud and corporate espionage." David casually checked his limited edition watch. He gave me a brief approving nod, then he turned his gaze toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. "Right on schedule," David noted. The doors swung open for the second time. Two men wearing dark suits and stern expressions walked into the room, followed closely by two uniformed police officers. They bypassed my horrified parents and walked directly toward Bradley. The lead agent pulled out a metallic badge and flashed it with practiced authority. "Bradley, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and the illegal sale of stolen intellectual property," the agent announced, his voice echoing loudly in the tense boardroom. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Bradley scrambled backward, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He bumped into the glass wall, looking like a trapped animal. "No," he shrieked, his voice climbing to a hysterical pitch. No, you cannot do this. I am a chief executive officer. I am a founder. Dad, do something. Tell them they cannot take me. The officers did not hesitate. They moved forward swiftly, grabbing his arms and twisting them firmly behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of metal handcuffs snapping shut reverberated through the room. It was the sound of his entire fraudulent empire locking him inside a permanent cage. Mom Bradley screamed, thrashing wildly against the firm grip of the federal agents. Mom, please help me. Alyssa is framing me. Do not let them take me away. Patricia had just regained full consciousness. She sat slumped in her chair, clutching her chest as she watched the federal agents drag her golden boy toward the exit. She reached a weak, trembling hand out toward him, tears streaming down her pale, horrified face. She tried to speak, but only a broken, breathless sob escaped her lips. Richard stood paralyzed. He watched his son, the man he believed was a visionary, crying like a frightened child. My father did not intervene. He did not yell at the agents. He simply stared at the floor, defeated by the reality of his son and his catastrophic crimes. I remained seated in the chairman position, hands folded calmly on the table. I watched Bradley struggle against the handcuffs as he was hauled out of my building. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. He was finally paying the ultimate price for his arrogance. The heavy glass doors swung shut, cutting off the frantic echoes of Bradley shouting down the corridor. The profound silence that rushed in to fill the boardroom was completely deafening. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, my hands resting easily on the smooth walnut table, and watched my parents process the absolute destruction of their golden child. For 33 years, they had built their entire identities around his perceived brilliance. They had sacrificed their finances, their morals, and their relationship with me just to keep him on a pedestal. Now that pedestal was a federal holding cell. Patricia slowly lowered her trembling hands from her face. Her perfect makeup was entirely ruined, running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked at the empty space where her son had just been standing, and then she turned her devastated eyes toward me. The fierce, condescending matriarch who had spent decades tearing me down was completely gone. In her place was a broken, terrified woman who finally understood the terrifying magnitude of the power dynamic in the room. Richard remained glued to his seat, his broad shoulders slumped in total defeat. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. He stared at the hard drive and the printed contract still resting on the table. The undeniable proof of his son and his criminal behavior was staring him right in the face. He could no longer blame predatory investors or corporate bullies. The villain of the story was his own flesh and blood. Alyssa, please, Patricia whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, ragged sob. You have to stop this. Call those agents right now and tell them it is a huge misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the expenses. Tell them he had permission to take the code. You have the power to fix this. I looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. I have the power to do a lot of things, Mom, I stated clearly. But I will absolutely not commit perjury to save a thief. He committed federal wire fraud. He embezzled millions of dollars from my private equity firm. He attempted to sell proprietary technology to a rival corporation. Those are not family misunderstandings. Those are serious felonies. My father suddenly lurched forward out of his chair. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself against the edge of the boardroom table. He moved toward me with a staggering, desperate gait. Alyssa, you cannot let them put your brother in a federal prison. Richard pleaded, his voice thick with sheer panic. He will not survive in a place like that. He is not built for it. We will pay you back. We will find a way to return every single dollar he took. Just please drop the charges. Pay me back with what exactly I asked, tilting my head slightly. You pawned your entire retirement jewelry collection yesterday just to buy his plane ticket. You are facing imminent eviction from a house you do not even own. Your bank accounts are entirely empty. You possess absolutely nothing of value to offer me. The harsh, unforgiving reality of their financial ruin finally shattered the last remaining ounce of Patricia and her pride. She slid out of her expensive leather chair and collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor. She literally dropped to her knees, crawling the short distance toward the head of the table. She reached up, trying to grab the sleeve of my bespoke suit, but I smoothly pulled my arm back, refusing to let her touch me. "Please, Alyssa." Patricia wept, her tears falling freely onto the floor. "I am begging you on my hands and knees. Have mercy on us. He is your brother. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot destroy your own family like this. Please, have mercy." Richard dropped to his knees right beside her, bowing his head in total submission. "We are so sorry." He choked out, his voice muffled by his own tears. "We were wrong about you. We were completely blind. Just give him another chance. Do not take our son away from us. Blood is thicker than water, Alyssa. Please remember that." I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I watched them grovel and beg on the floor of my corporate headquarters. I searched my heart for a single shred of sympathy, a single tear of regret, or a fleeting moment of familial guilt. I found absolutely nothing. The well of my compassion had run completely dry years ago. I slowly stood up from the chairman's seat, towering over them. I looked down at them without a single tear in my eyes. "Blood does not give you the right to steal from my company," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "And it certainly does not act as a shield for a felon. You love to throw around the word family now that you are desperate. But where was that family loyalty when I was struggling? Where was that loyalty when you mocked my career, belittled my lifestyle, and treated me like an unwanted burden?" My parents continued to weep, unable to formulate a response to the undeniable truth of my words. "You made your choice years ago when you decided my worth was tied entirely to my bank account." I continued, my voice remaining razor-sharp and coldly professional. "You measured my value based on how much money I made and how flashy my lifestyle appeared. You worshipped Bradley because he gave you the illusion of wealth, and you discarded me because you thought I was poor. Well, you were right. My worth is tied to my bank account. And my bank account just fired him." Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. They were completely destroyed forever. I walked out of the corporate boardroom, leaving them on the cold floor. I did not look back. The heavy glass doors sealed shut, closing the most toxic chapter of my entire life. The legal machinery I had set into motion took over from there, operating with ruthless efficiency. Fast forward exactly 3 months, and the landscape of my family had been entirely terraformed by the consequences of their own actions. Bradley did not get a cinematic trial. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no brilliant defense attorney twisting the facts to save the misunderstood genius. You need actual liquid capital to hire a high-powered defense team, and Bradley was completely bankrupt. He was appointed a public defender who took one look at the mountain of irrefutable evidence we handed over to the federal prosecutors. The digital logs, the intercepted offshore wire transfers, the signed intellectual property contract, and the encrypted hard drive full of embezzled funds were impossible to contest. His lawyer advised him that fighting the charges in federal court would result in a maximum sentence of 20 years. Faced with the terrifying reality of a trial he was guaranteed to lose, Bradley broke. The arrogant tech chief executive officer was reduced to a weeping, terrified shell of a man. He took a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and gross embezzlement. The judge was not swayed by his pathetic apologies or his claims that he was just trying to save his startup. The judicial system saw him for exactly what he was: a privileged thief who stole millions to fund a lavish fake lifestyle. Bradley was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole for at least 5. The day he was transferred to the federal facility, he looked directly at the news cameras gathered outside the courthouse. His eyes were completely hollow. The golden boy was gone forever, replaced by federal inmate number 8472. He would spend the next half-decade wearing a standard-issue uniform, stripped of every luxury he ever thought he deserved. Jasmine managed to escape a matching prison jumpsuit, but she did not escape her personal hell. The non-prosecution agreement David drafted kept her out of a federal indictment, but it required her total cooperation and a full admission of guilt regarding the fraudulent expense reports. The moment she walked out of our corporate office that Friday, she knew her high society life was permanently over. She immediately filed for divorce, desperately trying to legally sever herself from Bradley and his radioactive reputation. She hired a cheap divorce attorney and aggressively fought to retain whatever personal assets were not directly tied to the stolen corporate funds. It was a pathetic scavenger hunt. She managed to keep her wedding ring, a few mid-tier designer outfits, and her personal savings account, which held less than $10,000. Everything else, the cars, the luxury bags, the rented mansion, was seized to satisfy the corporate restitution orders. Her social execution was absolute. The wealthy influencers she had desperately courted treated her like a highly contagious disease. She was entirely blacklisted from every country club, charity gala, and upscale restaurant in the metropolitan area. The sheer suffocating humiliation of going from a wealthy tech wife to a broke, soon-to-be divorced informant was too much for her fragile ego to handle. Jasmine packed her few remaining suitcases into a rented economy car and fled the state. I heard through the legal grapevine that she relocated to a modest working-class suburb in the Midwest, working as a retail associate at a mid-level department store. She was forced to live the exact mundane, invisible life she had spent years mocking me for ringing up customers and folding clothes just to make her monthly rent. While Bradley and Jasmine experienced their downfalls, I turned my attention to the burning wreckage they left behind. NovaStream was technically insolvent when I forced Bradley out, but the underlying technology, the proprietary source code he tried to sell, was genuinely brilliant. The problem was never the product. The problem was the highly toxic, incompetent leadership at the top. I directed Apex Holdings to fully absorb the startup, transforming it from a standalone company into an internal division of my private equity firm. David and I ruthlessly cleaned house. We fired every useless executive Bradley had hired to inflate his ego. We eliminated the bloated marketing budget, canceled the absurd luxury office leases, and terminated the unnecessary consultant contracts. We took the remaining capital and injected it directly into the core engineering department. I personally met with the lead developers who actually built the algorithm while Bradley took credit. I doubled their salaries, offered them substantial equity stakes, and gave them the resources they actually needed. The end results were spectacular. Under competent, rational leadership, the software development accelerated at a rapid pace. Within those same 3 months, the NovaStream technology was successfully integrated into 3 massive hospital systems across the country, streamlining their internal data processing and saving them millions of dollars annually. The market valuation of the proprietary code skyrocketed. What was once a failing startup drowning in embezzled debt was now a highly profitable asset, generating massive returns for Apex Holdings. I had meticulously taken the exact company my older brother used to falsely elevate himself and turned it into my own crowning achievement. Every time the national financial press published an article praising the miraculous turnaround of the NovaStream technology, they credited the aggressive visionary leadership of Apex Holdings. Bradley had to sit in his bleak federal prison cell, reading the daily financial newspapers in the noisy common room, and watch me succeed wildly with the exact tools he foolishly squandered. He was forced to witness my absolute triumph from behind cold steel bars, completely powerless, knowing his own foolish greed handed me the ultimate victory on a silver platter. While Bradley adjusted to the harsh reality of a concrete federal cell, my parents faced their own brutal descent into consequence. The 30-day eviction notice I had served them was not a bluff. It was a highly strict, legally binding countdown to the inevitable end of their privileged existence. They had foolishly drained every single cent of their savings to fund Bradley and his fraudulent tech startup. They had literally pawned their valuable retirement jewelry to buy his useless escape ticket. When the first of the month arrived, the market rate rent I demanded was entirely impossible for them to pay. They did not have the cash, the credit, or the assets to secure a personal loan. For 30 days, they lived in a state of absolute denial, hoping I would magically change my mind, hoping the daughter they had abused for 3 decades would suddenly swoop in and save them from their own catastrophic financial decisions. When the county sheriff arrived at their front door on day 31 with the official eviction mandate, the illusion shattered completely. They were forced to pack whatever clothes and basic necessities they could fit into their aging sedan and leave the exact sprawling suburban house they had proudly claimed as their very own forever. The harsh reality of the housing market without a trust fund or a golden child to bail them out was a devastating shock. With ruined credit and zero liquid capital, Patricia and Richard could not qualify for a nice rental in their preferred affluent neighborhood. They were forced to relocate to a cramped, low-income apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast was absolutely staggering. Gone were the high vaulted ceilings, the pristine landscaping, and the quiet, tree-lined streets they had enjoyed for decades. Their new reality consisted of peeling linoleum floors, thin walls that failed to block the noise of their neighbors, and a view of a busy highway overpass. The physical downgrade was severe, but the psychological toll was what truly broke them. My mother, who had spent her entire life judging people based on their zip code, was now living in the exact type of neighborhood she had ruthlessly mocked. My father, a man who built his entire identity on the appearance of wealth, was reduced to clipping grocery store coupons and taking a retail job as a hardware store greeter, just to buy groceries. Their physical displacement was mirrored by a complete and total social execution. The boardroom scandal did not stay contained within the glass walls of my corporate headquarters. High society is a remarkably small and incredibly vicious world. When the news broke that Bradley was going to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement, the shockwaves decimated my parents and their carefully cultivated social standing. The wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress treated them like absolute pariahs. Their application to renew their country club membership was quietly but firmly denied by the board of directors. The invitations to charity galas, exclusive dinner parties, and wine tastings evaporated overnight. When Patricia tried to show up at her weekly social luncheon, the other women refused to make eye contact, effectively freezing her out until she left the restaurant in humiliated tears. They had spent their entire lives treating superficial social status as the ultimate currency. Now their own accounts were entirely bankrupt. They were completely isolated, left alone in a tiny apartment to face the terrifying silence of their ruined lives and the absolute shame of raising a convicted federal felon. In their absolute isolation, they finally turned back to the only person who actually had the power to save them: me. The irony was palpable and incredibly satisfying. The daughter they had called worthless, the woman they had commanded to get out of their house, was now their only beacon of hope. They began calling my personal cell phone relentlessly. My call logs were flooded with dozens of missed calls every single day from their new prepaid mobile phones. When I did not answer, they resorted to leaving long, pathetic voicemails. I sat in my penthouse office listening to the recorded sounds of their desperation with absolute clinical detachment. Patricia would sob heavily into the receiver, begging for forgiveness, swearing that she realized how terribly wrong she had been all these years. She claimed she had been completely blinded by Bradley and his manipulation, and that she just wanted her beautiful, brilliant daughter back in her life. Richard would leave frantic messages asking if I could just send them a monthly stipend to help them afford a slightly better apartment or pay for a highly skilled appellate lawyer to help Bradley reduce his lengthy prison sentence. They threw themselves at my mercy, forgetting they had shown me absolutely none. I listened to their final voicemail on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Patricia was weeping, asking why I was being so incredibly cold, and demanding to know how I could turn my back on my own flesh and blood after everything they had supposedly done for me. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt absolutely nothing for them. They were not apologizing because they were genuinely sorry for how they had treated me. They were only apologizing because they were finally experiencing the painful, crushing consequences of their own toxic actions and desperately wanted my money to make the suffering stop. I deleted the long voicemail without even finishing it. I picked up my phone, navigated to the security settings, and requested a complete number change from my cellular provider. Within 5 minutes, the line was permanently disconnected. I did not send a warning text. I did not leave a final message explaining my decision or offering closure. I simply erased their access to me forever, establishing an absolute unbreakable boundary of permanent no contact. They were finally forced to exist in the exact miserable, lonely reality they had built for themselves. The silence in my penthouse office was nothing short of magnificent. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a family dinner where everyone was waiting for the next cruel insult to drop. It was the rich, insulated quiet of being perched 60 floors above the bustling city streets, protected by reinforced glass, and an impenetrable fortress of personal success. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the intricate grid of the financial district. The tiny cars and miniature people moving far below looked like a well-organized machine. I had spent my entire life feeling small, feeling like one of those insignificant dots navigating a world controlled by other people. My parents and my brother had spent decades trying to convince me that I belonged at the very bottom. But now, looking out over the sprawling metropolis that housed my empire, I knew exactly where I belonged. I belonged at the absolute top. The gentle hum of the private elevator announced David and his arrival. The polished oak doors slid open, and my most trusted ally stepped into the executive suite. He did not carry his usual leather briefcase or thick stacks of legal documents today. The legal battles were entirely concluded. The corporate restructuring was a massive success. The federal prosecutors had everything they needed to keep Bradley secured in his concrete cell for years. There were no more fires to put out, no more toxic relatives to outmaneuver, and no more traps to spring. David walked across the plush carpet holding a delicate porcelain saucer and a steaming cup of freshly brewed espresso. The rich, dark aroma of roasted coffee beans immediately filled the spacious office. "You look like someone who just conquered a small country," David said, with a rare, genuine smile, placing the espresso carefully on my mahogany desk. Or perhaps someone who finally finished taking out the trash. I turned away from the panoramic view of the city and walked over to my desk. "Both, actually," I replied, returning his smile. The latest quarterly reports for the newly integrated NovaStream division came in this morning. The hospital systems have completely adapted to the software, and our revenue projections are exceeding every single metric we established. The engineers are thriving now that they actually have competent leadership. David adjusted his suit jacket, nodding in deep satisfaction. It is amazing what a company can accomplish when the chief executive officer is not actively stealing from the payroll to buy luxury cars and designer handbags. He paused, his expression turning slightly more reflective. "The legal department confirmed that the final eviction proceedings for your parents were completed without incident. The property is vacant and ready for the real estate agents to list on the market. And I understand you completely disconnected your personal communication lines." "Yes," I said, settling into my high-backed leather chair. "I severed the final thread this afternoon. There is absolutely no way for them to reach me ever again. They have been officially erased from my orbit." "You played a flawless game," Alyssa David said softly, tapping the edge of the desk. "Most people would have let their emotions ruin the strategy. They would have yelled, screamed, and demanded apologies. You stayed completely analytical." David gave me a respectful nod and quietly exited the office, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked down at the wide expanse of my mahogany desk. Right in the center, catching the afternoon sunlight, sat a small, elegant glass and wood display case. Inside the protective glass was the crisp $20 bill Bradley had thrown at my chest at the Michelin star restaurant. I reached out and gently traced the edge of the glass case with my index finger. That single piece of currency represented the defining moment of my entire existence. It was the physical manifestation of their boundless arrogance. Bradley had thrown it at me because he genuinely believed I was a pathetic, helpless creature who could not even afford a cup of coffee. My parents had laughed because they believed my worth was entirely non-existent. They thought they possessed all the power because they were loud, flashy, and cruelly dominant. I spent years believing that the only way to win against toxic people was to fight them on their level. I thought I needed to argue with my mother to prove myself to my father to outshine my brother. Society constantly tells women that we need to demand our seat at the table, that we need to shout to be heard, that we need to force toxic people to validate our existence. But sitting in my penthouse surrounded by the empire I had built with my own hands, I finally understood the absolute truth about power. True power is not yelling. True power is not begging for respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. True power does not require you to convince your abusers that you are worthy of love. True power is building your empire in total, unwavering silence. It is focusing your energy entirely on your own growth, your own financial independence, and your own unshakable peace of mind. I did not destroy my family. I simply handed them enough rope, and they enthusiastically tied their own noose. Their overwhelming greed, their desperate need for superficial status, and their malicious cruelty were the exact weapons that caused their downfall. I just stood back and let their own arrogance destroy them. I let Bradley steal his way into a federal prison. I let Jasmine flaunt her way into total social exile. I let my parents enable their way into absolute poverty. I never had to raise my voice. I never had to compromise my integrity. I simply held the door open while they marched themselves directly into oblivion. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound, radiant sense of tranquility wash over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood, the years of relentless emotional abuse, and the constant feeling of never being good enough were completely gone. They had evaporated into the crisp, clean air of my new reality. I was free. I was undeniably, permanently free. I reached out and picked up the delicate porcelain cup David had brought me. The espresso was still piping hot. I brought the cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The bold, complex flavor of the dark roast washed over my tongue. It did not just taste like premium coffee. It tasted like sweet, absolute freedom. It tasted like total victory. It tasted like a future where I dictated every single term of my own happiness. Best cup of coffee I have ever had. The story of Alyssa teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of toxic relationships and the true definition of personal power. When we are trapped in dynamics with narcissistic or manipulative family members, our first instinct is often to fight back loudly. We passionately want to argue to defend our character and to force these toxic individuals to finally see our worth. However, this narrative perfectly illustrates that engaging in emotional warfare only feeds the toxicity. Narcissists thrive on your emotional reactions. They want you to yell, cry, and defend yourself because it actively proves they still hold power over your mental state. The ultimate lesson here is that true strength lies in radical detachment and silent execution. Alyssa did not waste her valuable energy trying to convince her family that she was successful. Instead, she channeled all of her focus into building an unassailable fortress of financial and personal independence. She realized that you do not have to actively destroy toxic people to win. If you establish ironclad boundaries and remove yourself from their chaotic games, their own arrogance, greed, and lack of accountability will inevitably trigger their downfall. They will always construct their own traps. Living well is genuinely the best revenge. When you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your energy. You can redirect that energy into building a life so beautiful and secure that their opinions simply cease to matter. You learn to protect your peace at all costs, understanding that blood relations do not ever excuse toxic behavior. If this story inspired you to set firmer boundaries and focus on building your own silent empire, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.